Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for spending your lunch hour here with us. So I want to begin with a headline from the Washington Post last month. Kuwait plans to create a huge DNA database of residents and visitors. Scientists are appalled. The new law, which will go into effect very soon, would be the first of its kind in the world. The database is expected to include 1.3 million citizens and 2.9 million expatriates, costing approximately $400 million. All newborn babies will be subject to testing, and in order for citizens to receive their new passports, they must first submit their DNA. And in case any of you are planning a visit anytime soon, there's going to be a station set up in the airport, which will require all new arrivals to submit cheek swabs or blood samples. Officials originally passed the law after an ISIS-linked man set off a bomb in a mosque, killing 27 people last year. So they say the database can help fight terrorism and crime, as well as help identify victims of large-scale attacks. But critics claim that there's more to the story, specifically as it relates to the already fraught status of the Bidoon minority shown protesting here, who many worry will be further threatened if DNA tests are used to arbitrate citizenship. As one report explained, Kuwaiti citizenship is restricted to families that have been there since 1920 and is passed down through a father's bloodlines, with few exceptions. Being an oil-rich country, Kuwaiti citizenship comes with a long list of benefits, including free education through college, free health care, grocery subsidies, unemployment benefits, and monthly government checks per child. Let's all move there. The Bidoon are stateless descendants of nomadic Arab tribes that the Kuwaiti government considers illegal residents, though some have acquired citizenship over the years through marriage and adoption. A researcher at Human Rights Watch explained that as the law was being passed, people who knew the intricacies of the Bidoon issue were saying this database has nothing to do with terrorism and criminal activity, but has more to do with the state at a moment when oil prices are down and the government has to suddenly talk about taxing its own citizens and cutting all sorts of benefits. The UN Human Rights Commission, among others, are concerned that this is just the beginning, and that copycat laws in other countries are soon to follow. Some scientists, including the European Society of Human Genetics, have tried to intervene, penning op-eds to highlight all the downsides of DNA collection in this manner, as well as writing directly to the Kuwaiti government. One way we could understand the consternation expressed by these researchers is that the Kuwaiti law runs directly against and potentially undercuts widespread attempts at public engagement to build legitimacy for population biobanks in Europe and the US. The Kuwaiti policy in many ways relinks genetics with forms of state coercion and eugenics from which the field has been working so hard to distance itself. So, in using the Kuwaiti case as a springboard for this discussion, there are many things we could potentially focus on. For instance, one thing I'm interested in is whether and how people are able to refuse participation in initiatives such as this. The Kuwaiti government, for instance, expects about 200 to 250,000 people to decline testing, and serious punishments await them: a year in jail or $33,000 fine for refusers, and 7 years in prison for those who might forge samples. And so one of the things I've been trying to think about within the literature on biological citizenship is the practice of biodefection, where people resist what Michael Montoya has called bioethnic conscription by the state or other institutions. So I describe informed refusal as a necessary corollary to informed consent in the broader framework of a justice-based bioethics, to help us think beyond individual autonomy and beneficence to engage questions of power and stratification. For those who might be interested in talking more about these bioethical dimensions, feel free to bring it up when we open things up in a little while. For the purposes of the talk, however, I'd like us to use the Kuwait case to open up a much broader discussion around data and democracy and pose an even more fundamental kind of question. That is, where is the human in the data? In so doing, I'd like for us to think together about some of the stakes involved, extending well beyond genomic data and past the use of data that appear obviously bad, to include in our analysis the more banal and seemingly more benign forms of data production where the social and political dimensions may be hidden from view. In this wider empirical terrain, my overriding concern is with the fraught relationship between innovation and inequity, freedom and containment, and where the question that keeps me up at night is this: who and what has to be fixed in place, classified, corralled, coerced, or capitalized upon so that others can be free to know and do, play, and experiment? So I'll just point out this concern overlaps in many ways with the work of Professor Razak, whose most recent book about systemic violence against Indigenous people in Canada is called Dying from Improvement. And it forces us to ask, for whom is the civilizing mission of the settler colonial state really an upgrade? Likewise, in Professor Harris's groundbreaking essay, Whiteness as Property, where she elucidates the legal construction of race in the US, and where we learn how, quote, expanding of democratic rights for whites was accompanied by the contraction of rights of blacks in an ever-deepening cycle of oppression. Her analysis exemplifies this relationality that I'm concerned with in the context of technoscientific innovation. After all, we can understand the law itself as a kind of social technology that creates parallel universes in which the liberty of some was engineered in direct relation to the propertization of others. So it's this relationship that I'd like us to keep at the forefront of our thinking. Moving forward then, I've structured the talk loosely in 4 parts, which I'd like you to think of more as provocations rather than a traditional research talk with a linear argument. And while it may not be immediately obvious at first how each part ties into the next, I think we can use the gaps between them to generate discussion, making the connections together. So first, I'll briefly share with you how I grew concerned with the social implications of science and technology, sketching some of the professional and personal stakes. Then I'll discuss a range of contemporary examples that we could place under the rubric of dehumanizing data. And my aim with this is to get us thinking about the importance of socio-technical design in perpetuating and in intervening in unjust systems. Thirdly, I'll tie in my work on how racial, caste, and national distinctions shape genomic science. And here I'd like us to reflect on what it means to look for the genetic underpinnings of social identity, specifically when the protagonists of such claims are those that we might think of as subaltern activists, rather than, say, state actors and policymakers. So the question for us is not only where is the human in the data, but also which humans are producing and using the data, to what ends, and how does this matter to our critical interventions. Finally, I'm going to zoom the lens back out and briefly highlight 5 ways that we often limit our approach to innovation and equity in the context of our pedagogy, in terms of policy, and in civic participation. My aim here is to stretch our collective imagination beyond what's deemed realistic in the realm of data and democracies to a point where our analyses starts to meet our aspirations. So let me just acknowledge now, this is a lot. I'm going to put a lot on the table for us to chew on. And part of the reason for this is because we're coming to the conversation from so many different disciplinary and experiential backgrounds. So this approach gives us, I think, just enough shared ground that we can talk with rather than past one another. With that, I'll get started by sharing just a couple experiences with you, recent and more distant, that shape my thinking on these issues. So one of the things that I observe on a routine basis is how those investing in biotechnology don't limit themselves to what might be deemed realistic. As one journalist reporting on the $3 billion California Stem Cell Initiative put it, imagine cardiac cells beating in a petri dish, being used to form human tissue that might be used to replace damaged heart muscle. Imagine, indeed. Scientific inquiry, it turns out, is situated as much in the realm of imagination as it is in the realm of reason. And in the past year, we seem to have entered an accelerated phase of speculation and investment in precision medicine in particular. With these developments have come a number of meetings and summits focused on the ethical, legal, social, and to a lesser extent political implications of intervening in and editing and even synthesizing human biology in fundamental ways. So I'm just going to give you a few glimpses of this that's happened in the past year. In May 2015, Emory University Center for Ethics convened a meeting called Biotechnology and Ethical Imagination International Summit. It was held soon after the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing techniques were first publicized, with headlines like, "Scientists may soon be able to cut and paste DNA to cure deadly disease and design perfect babies." Another headline stated, "China embraces genetic modification and human cloning." And finally, "CRISPR is getting better. Now it's time to ask the hard ethical questions." In December 2015, the US National Academies of Science, in conjunction with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and UK Royal Society, hosted an international summit on gene editing with a panel on interrogating equity that I participated on. Then again, on May 10th, Harvard Medical School hosted a meeting that was originally called Human Genome Project Part 2. But in response to critics who questioned that framing, ended up being rebranded as HGP Write, W-R-I-T-E, where the goal was not only to talk about mapping and reading the human genome, but begin piloting projects that construct synthetic genomes from scratch. As an aside, something I didn't realize until I was sitting at the airport on my way to Boston for this meeting, when I received an email from the organizers asking participants not to tweet about it or contact any media outlets about the meeting, was that this was intended to be a closed session. The organizers told us that, quote, "We intentionally did not invite media because we want everyone to speak freely and candidly without concerns about being misquoted or misinterpreted as the discussions evolve." In response, synthetic biologist Drew Endy, who I think was invited but was not in attendance, tweeted, "If you need secrecy to discuss your proposed research, you are doing something wrong." And finally, in June of this year, the White House and Gates Foundation teamed up for a Precision Public Health Summit in San Francisco as part of the Obama administration's Precision Medicine Initiative. Its aim is to build a 1 million-person cohort from whom data of every conceivable kind will be collected and stored in one colossal database, where scientists can access it for an endless array of studies. Taken together, all these convenings would seem to point to increased capacity to produce data about and intervene in human biology, as well as heightened concerns around our ability to do so. As one commentator notes, precision medicine sounds like an inarguably good thing. It begins with the observation that individuals vary in their genetic makeup and that their diseases and responses to medications differ as a result. It then aims to find the right drug for the right patient at the right time, every time. But, and this individual continues, although precision medicine might make sense for people with certain conditions that are difficult and expensive to treat, some critics argue that on the whole, simpler approaches to treating disease are better because they cost less and benefit far more patients. One pediatrician and epidemiologist agreed, saying, let's say we find a targeted drug that can lower risk of diabetes by 2/3. It would cost about $150,000 a year per person for that drug if we had it. A simple program focused on diet and exercise would do the same. Lifespan has increased by about a decade in the past 50 years, and none of that gain is related to DNA. It's learning about smoking and diet and exercise. It's old-fashioned stuff, end quote. And I tend to agree. Investing in more of the old-fashioned stuff when it comes to health and medicine sounds like a great idea. But I'd also like us to take stock of what seems to animate this lopsided investment. So more on that point in just a minute. But first, as a way to put the human in my own data, I want to take a little detour and give you a sense of the more personal dimensions of this work as they directly inform the professional stakes. So when I was 14 years old, my family moved from South Carolina to the South Pacific because my parents were asked to serve as advisors to the Marshallese Ministry of Education. Soon after arriving, I discovered my main source of entertainment in half a dozen boxes containing my dad's old VHS tapes, where I found recordings of every episode of Star Trek Next Generation, and quickly got hooked as a lifelong Trekkie. Years later, I routinely encounter people in my fieldwork in the biotech world who profess that Star Trek and other speculative accounts of the future initially inspired their work. If you recall, the most common device on Star Trek was the tricorder, personalized medicine at its best. Dr. Beverly Crusher used it to scan patients' bodies to obtain an exact diagnosis. A recent news report on the Biological Office of the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, is described as a small, secretive Pentagon outpost that has more than a whiff of Star Trek about it. Its mission: invest in research that sounds like science fiction. In February 2015, a Belgian entrepreneur who designed the first functioning handheld that measures all patient vitals and provides a complete echocardiogram reading told CNN that Star Trek was more than just a movie. It was a business plan. Likewise, the CEO of a Houston-based company that's working on similar non-invasive devices to regenerate bones and muscles commented, "It's not just science fiction anymore. All indications are the 21st century life sciences will change dramatically during the next several decades." So, as with most prognostications coming out of the biotech industry, change is usually presumed to mean better than the present. But better for whom and by what measures are questions that such forecasts rarely critically interrogate. So as I consider how yesterday's fiction so often serves as tomorrow's blueprint, I've slowly come to grips with the importance of imagination in the design of biotechnology and social equity alike. Now keep in mind, my introduction to the world of futurist technology in Star Trek took place in the Marshall Islands, which many of you will recall was the site of US nuclear testing in 1954, where in the 1990s, I got a close-up view of the environmental, social, and public health catastrophe that still impacts people's lives there today. On a number of occasions, I traveled from the Marshallese capital of Majuro, where my family lived, to visit neighboring islands. The two that made the biggest impression on me was Kwajalein, a US Army installation and manufactured suburbia, which was occupied almost entirely by military personnel and their families, who enjoyed golf courses, Baskin-Robbins, and a long list of amenities. You can see where my little 13-year-old head was at. I'm like, ice cream. And the neighboring island of Ibai, where islanders who were forced off of Kwajalein to make room for the army base and now reside in a crowded shanty town that contains very little vegetation. Ibai residents require a special pass to travel to Kwajalein for work, and many of them barely subsist off of the small compensation for the nuclear fallout and military dislocation. Needless to say, the health of Marshallese suffer dramatically, both from the direct fallout of nuclear testing, but also because of the deeply unequal social and economic conditions of their present lives, which explains, for example, the high rates of chronic and infectious diseases, including a TB rate that's 23 times that of the United States. Here you can see Marshallese kids playing dead in a make-believe cemetery, where a mix of fiction and reality, child's play and public policy take on lethal implications. And in hindsight, I think my concerns with the social dimensions of science and technology stem from these early observations of how inequality is engineered. In many ways, the Marshall Islands can serve as a metaphor for modernity, in which the health and well-being of some are predicated on the immiseration of others. In a world such as this, I don't think we can talk about re-engineering biology without also discussing the ongoing engineering of social inequality. and without careful attention to whose version of the good life is being imagined and coded, while others are being ignored and even devoured through such lopsided investments. So when I speak of envisioning innovation and equity in the talk's theme, this is not mere rhetorical flourish. I want us to take seriously the notion that there are in fact competing imaginaries that are fighting over our collective future. Quoting Arjun Appadurai, I want to insist on the theoretical significance of imagination as no longer mere fantasy, opium for the masses whose real work is elsewhere. No longer simple escape from a world defined principally by more concrete purposes and structures. No longer elite pastime, thus not relevant to the lives of ordinary people. And no longer mere contemplation, irrelevant for new forms of desire and subjectivity. The imagination has become an organized field of social practices, a form of work, both in the sense of labor and culturally organized practice, and a form of negotiation between individuals and globally defined fields of possibility. And what I found in studying the social dimensions of biotechnology is that imaginations tend to go limp when confronted with entrenched inequality and dispossession, despite the mounds of evidence we have that such processes get under our skin and impact every aspect of our health and well-being. For many, the idea that we could defy politics as usual and channel human ingenuity towards more egalitarian forms of social organization is utterly far-fetched. Yet we can imagine growing heart cells in a lab. The fact is, innovation and inequity too often go hand in hand. Social science research piled high shows us, as we develop the capacity to control disease and death, the benefits go disproportionately to those who already monopolize resources. So that despite promises to the contrary, I don't think we should assume a kind of trickle-down biotechnology. We either prioritize issues of equity and justice upstream, or we ensure a world that resembles films like Gattaca and Elysium, where the health and longevity of some is predicated on the disposability of others. One of the most important arenas where I think it's vital for us to grapple with the power of imagination in reproducing forms of social domination is in the design of machine learning, and we're so lucky to have Professor Sophia Noble here. And so before moving on to a discussion of the life sciences, which is where the bulk of my research has rested, I'd like to provide a few examples of how racial logics and assumptions shape data science as a way for us to grapple with broader processes of design. Welcome to the first international beauty contest judged by artificial intelligence. This was the headline for a project called Beauty AI, which received over 6,000 submissions from approximately 100 countries. So people downloaded the app and then took a selfie, and the robot jury examined all the photos and chose a queen and a king for each age group. For humans, the rules were no makeup, no glasses, and no beard. So all the hipsters were disqualified. For the robots, the instructions were to detect and assess contestants based on a number of features: wrinkles, face symmetry, skin color, gender, age group, ethnicity, and many other parameters. What could go wrong, right? Well, on August 2nd of this year, the creators of Beauty AI reported that to their dismay, the robots did not like people with dark skin. Out of 44 winners across the various age groups, all were white except 6, and only 1 had visibly dark skin. The contest utilized what at the time was considered to be the most advanced machine learning technology called deep learning, in which the software is trained how to code beauty using pre-labeled images. The images of contestants are then judged against the preferences embedded in the algorithm. As one observer put it, the simplest explanation for biased algorithms is that the humans who create them have their own deeply entrenched biases. That means that despite perceptions that algorithms are somehow neutral and uniquely objective, they can often reproduce and amplify existing prejudices. Legal and political theorist Bernard Harcourt remarked, "The idea that you could come up with a culturally neutral, Racially neutral conception of beauty is simply mind-boggling. Beauty AI is a reminder that humans are really doing the thinking, he said, even when it's couched as algorithms and we think it's neutral and scientific, he said. In addition to the skewed racial results, the framing of this beauty contest as a precursor to precision medicine is actually quite fascinating and disconcerting. The team of data scientists explained that valuable information about people's health can be assessed just processing their photos, and that ultimately the hope is to find effective ways to slow down aging and help people look healthy and beautiful. Given the overwhelming whiteness of the winners and the conflation of socially biased notions of beauty with health, darker people in this scenario are implicitly coded as unhealthy and unfit. And while so-called racist robots judging the beauty contest may seem trivial at first, similar biases are built into technological systems with potentially far greater consequence. As one report put it, from retail to real estate, from employment to criminal justice, the use of data mining, scoring, and predictive software is proliferating. And when the software makes decisions based on data like a person's zip code, it can reflect or even amplify the results of historical institutional discrimination. For instance, investigative journalists at ProPublica carried out a massive study of software used around the country to predict future criminals and found it biased against Black people. Among the many thousands of cases they compared, they reported one particular story of 18-year-old Brescia Borden and 41-year-old Vernon Prater, shown here. Borden and her friend were arrested and charged with burglary and petty theft for stealing a bike valued at $80. Prater was picked up for shoplifting $86.35 worth of tools from a nearby Home Depot store. Borden had a record that included a few misdemeanors committed when she was a juvenile, but Prater was a more seasoned criminal. He had already been convicted of armed robbery and attempted armed robbery, for which he served 5 years in prison, in addition to another armed robbery charge. So all this before they are getting arrested this time. Yet, something odd happened when Borden and Prater were booked into jail. A computer program spat out a score predicting the likelihood of each committing a future crime. Borden was rated high risk and Prater was rated low risk. Scores like this are increasingly common in courtrooms across the nation. They're used to inform decisions about who can be set free at every stage of the criminal justice system, from assigning bond amounts to even more fundamental decisions about defendants' freedom. And in many states, the scores are given to judges during criminal sentencing. But 2 years later, we know that in this case, the computer algorithm got it exactly backward. Borden has not been charged with any new crimes. Prater is serving an 8-year prison term for subsequently breaking into a warehouse and stealing thousands of dollars worth of electronics. Not only did ProPublica find that the overall scores proved remarkably unreliable in forecasting violent crime, with only 20% of the people predicted to commit violent crimes actually doing so, but they also uncovered significant racial disparities. The formula was more likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this at almost twice the rate as white defendants, whereas white defendants were mislabeled as low risk more often than Black defendants. What's more, the for-profit company Northpoint that produces this particular algorithm is among the most widely used assessment tools in the country, but doesn't publicly disclose the calculations used to arrive at defendant scores. So it's not possible for either the defendants or the public to see what might be driving the disparity. Though the company did tell ProPublica the basics of its future crime formula, which includes factors such as education levels and whether a defendant has a job. So on the most basic level, one of the things we really need to consider is how a system that does not explicitly collect data on race produces racial results. And that precisely because programmers ignore the racial logics of the world they're co-producing through a kind of colorblind approach, there's no one to hold accountable, even as they continue to produce purportedly objective data that's not only biased, but proprietary, and thereby hidden from view. In a new book called Weapons of Math Destruction, data scientist Cathy O'Neill says it best. Big data processes codify the past. They do not invent the future. Doing that requires moral imagination, she says, and that's something only humans can provide. So in the last part of the discussion, I'm going to come around back to this idea of moral and ethical imagination vis-a-vis technoscience. But before we get to that, I want to switch gears to the third strand of the talk, as reflected in the title, The Emperor's New Genes. Here I want to enter this discussion by having us think about the deeply entrenched binary between the things that we call social and the things that we call natural, because it continues to do a lot of work, epistemic and political, including routinely positioning some people as subjects of science and some as objects. In popular understandings, the idea that what's on the right side of your screen is a complex, constructed, dynamic social reality is often predicated on an unspoken yielding to an imagined, inherent, stable, natural side of human existence found on the left. So that the way that the humanities and social sciences often engage with the life sciences, when at all, is to assert the primacy of the sociocultural and the bankruptcy of naturalized explanations in order to win authority over the study of race, among other axes of difference. Exhibit A of this approach is the social scientific truism that many of us are familiar with, that race is a social construct, which can be traced back to this 1951 UNESCO statement. Here, the drafters state matter-of-factly, scientists are generally agreed that all men belong to a single species and are derived from a common stock. And then further down, they summarize the academic consensus at the time, saying, available scientific knowledge provides no basis for believing that the groups of mankind differ, and that on the contrary, it indicates that the major factor in explaining such differences is the history of the cultural experience which each group has undergone. And so the key phrase I really want to draw our attention to is this, available scientific evidence or knowledge. Because when we fast forward 50 years with the conclusion of the Human Genome Project and new bioinformatic tools that allow researchers to parse the genome and produce probabilistic differences across populations, a new old scientific consensus that asserts the existence of genetically determined racial groups is gaining steam. New old because it was never fully put to rest by the constructivist principle in the first place. And what's really striking here is not simply the hunt for racial differences by some life scientists, but its uptake by some sociologists. Published in 2012 by Shao and colleagues, this paper entitled The Genomic Challenge to the Social Construction of Race states, recent research on the human genome challenges the basic assumption that human races have no biological basis. It goes on to say that they offer a theoretical synthesis that accepts the existence of genetic clusters and consistent with certain racial classifications without diminishing the social character of their context, meaning, production, and consequences. Now, for those of you who are interested in a point-by-point engagement and critique of these findings, a full issue of the journal Sociological Theory is devoted to exactly this, including an excellent essay by Anne Morning. But for our purposes today, what I want to highlight is that while much has changed between the publication of that UNESCO statement and the Shao et al. Paper, both in the social milieu and the scientific techniques used to study difference, one thing has remained relatively constant, and that is the appeal to the life sciences to arbitrate the reality of race. Sociologists, myself included, seeking to unplug our students in the scholarly tradition of Morpheus, routinely begin intro to race courses with some version of the pronouncement, science proves that there's greater heterogeneity within a given racial group than across groups, thereby undermining, in our view, the biological validity and laying the foundation for the social reality of race. But now with the proliferation of difference findings, everything from hypertension to cancer, to a study that gives us a lot to chew on when it says ethnicity determines the bacteria in your mouth, we really have to revisit the science proves pronouncement upon which so much pedagogy and epistemology of race has rested, and ask what it means for social scientists to situate a constructivist framing on the authority of the life sciences, an issue I'm going to return to in just a minute. For now, let's briefly reflect on the stakes and tensions beyond the social sciences, because I find that trying to open up an interdisciplinary conversation that deepens and broadens our understanding of the often messy and interesting intersections of biology and society matters well beyond the debates for any one discipline. And it should come as no surprise that language plays a role in these broader stakes. For instance, the director of the South African Genome Program once explained the promise of the field to me in these terms. The sheer quantity of information contained in the genome is analogous to 6,000 books, 1,000 pages per book, with 1,000 letters per page. So basically a whole lot of information. Here he is with a computer chip that can hold this massive amount of data. But as so often happens when the book of life image of the genome is used, questions about who has the power and expertise to translate and infer meaning from genomic information are often obscured. For this reason, I often think about the literary theorist Gayatri Spivak's classic query, can the subaltern speak? And wonder whether the subaltern genome can really code. As a reservoir of symbols, codes, stories, metaphors about the world, the field like genetics shapes and can even overpower our understanding of history and culture. For example, there's been some great work on how metaphors in and about science serve as heuristics that help us see and not see particular aspects of the world we inherit. DNA as a map, a blueprint, a holy grail, a book of life, all of which have been critiqued in one way or another for viewing biology in overly deterministic ways, as if everything can be boiled down to the ACGT alphabet, the tyranny of heritability, as it were. And when this heritability then is linked to innate racial makeup, as it relates to IQ, for example, our metaphors about biology as more or less fixed grow ever more consequential in creating lethal hierarchies. But the good news is that language is malleable. And so an alternative set of genetic metaphors have come on the scene to account for the role of interactions, regulation, and environmental factors in gene expression and health outcomes. Networks, recipes, genes as servants of proteins, and even more poetically comparing genetic improvisation to a jazz orchestra. And as we see, these begin to give us a language to account for indeterminacy and fluidity, which again has consequences for how we think about racial differences across a number of contexts. In the article I've referenced here, the authors seek a lingua democratica rather than a lingua franca for debate on genetics, saying that metaphors can serve as a prophylactic against reification, arguing also for the need to, quote, counteract the privileged position of scientists whose metaphoric descriptions tend to obscure the implicit values hidden in their work. For example, this excerpt from a New York Times report in which a researcher working on a massive new genetic atlas initiative to map the history of population mixing over time is quoted as saying, in some sense, we don't want to talk to historians. There's a great virtue in being objective. You put the data in and get the history out. We do think this is a way of reconstructing history by just using DNA. And I say quoted as saying because when you really see what these researchers are saying in terms of their protocol, they have a much more nuanced and interesting view of collaborating with historians, but this is how it gets featured in the headlines. And so while this kind of DNA centrism may be troubling on a number of counts, I was actually quite delighted to see it expressed in blunt terms. It's an important reminder how, for some, the best science is ahistorical and asocial, and so it pushes us to more fully engage with these fields. So with that groundwork in place, I'm going to enter some of the social worlds in which people are actually trying to use genomic data, and we can see in some ways its malleability. And what I find interesting is this relative dexterity, but also in some ways the growing power and hegemony, insofar as those at different ends of the lines of power are using genomics to make competing political claims around race, nation, and belonging. And so this kind of epistemic agility or uncertainty about what the data means is why it seems in some ways to be so powerful and appealing. So one way that I signal this shift from what we might think of as the top-down and bottom-up uses of genomics is by referring to it as the emperor's new genes, where what's purportedly new is that biological notions of group identity are used not only by those exercising traditional modes of surveillance and authority, but also by subordinate social groups in service to what we might think of as emancipatory projects. The former, by comparison, is what we might call the emperor's old genes, which I'll briefly illustrate with an example from the UK and shares features with that Kuwaiti example we started with. In 2009, the UK Border Agency began using genetic ancestry testing and isotope analysis to corroborate the stories of asylum seekers. The aim of the Human Provenance pilot project was to distinguish true from false asylum claims. A major focus was telling Kenyans and Somalis apart, deporting the former if testing indicated they were lying about being Somali. Over 100 cases were vetted using genetic ancestry and isotope tests before the project came under severe criticism by refugee advocates and academic scientists who insisted that the underlying science could not be used in this way. David Balding, a population geneticist at Imperial College London, noted that genes don't respect national borders, as many legitimate citizens are migrants or direct descendants of migrants, and many national borders split ethnic groups. Mark Thomas, a geneticist of University College London who called the Human Provenance pilot project horrifying, contended that even determining a person's ancestry as distinct from nationality is more problematic than many believe. Mitochondrial DNA will never have the resolution to specify a country of origin. Many DNA ancestry testing companies, he says, have sprung up over the last 10 years, often based on mitochondrial DNA. But what they're selling is little better than genetic astrology. He said, Alec Jeffrey said, one of the pioneers of human DNA fingerprinting, that the border agency is clearly making huge and unwarranted assumptions about population structure in Africa. Even if it did work, which I doubt, he says, assigning a person to a population does not establish nationality. People move. The whole proposal is naive and scientifically flawed. And finally, as it relates to isotope testing, a specialist at Durham University, Janet Montgomery, explained that unless the border between Somalia and Kenya represented some major geological or hydrological division, I cannot see how isotopes will discriminate between people living there, let alone at or on the border. Isotopes do not respect national borders, she said, or convey some inherent national attribute. They are not passports. At the same time, when similar methods are used in ways that supposedly help subordinate groups, especially but not only in health research, this level of attention and critique is almost non-existent. And it's in this context where the science seems to be used for good that I want to now draw attention, where the investment is not so much on hierarchy and exclusion, but commodification and inclusion, genomics as a kind of post-colonial truth-telling and scientific reparation, to draw on Alondra Nelson's formulation. And what I suggest is that amidst the seeming empowerment of genomic claims, we mustn't lose sight of how the parameters of this social field, its rules and doxa, are constituted around a narrow definition of genetic life into which long-standing social divisions are euphemized as mere diversity, and where the question of what the state owes a particular group is increasingly reliant on scientific definitions of what constitutes the group in the first place. For the first example, we traveled to Kimberley, South Africa for a workshop on genomic sovereignty that included genomicists, lawyers, and ethicists alongside members of elected indigenous San councils from South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. And all were there to discuss the San's experience dealing with researchers from around the world who routinely seek their genetic samples because they're considered the oldest known lineage of modern humans. The director of the South African Genome Program hoped to begin a partnership with the San to establish best practices going forward, especially in light of this paper in Nature, which generated a lot of frustration and anger, which I can talk about a little bit more in our Q&A. And while there are a number of important themes that emerged in the workshop, I'll focus on the discussion that took place around genetic ancestry tests and what I've referred to earlier in this talk as the practice of diagnosing identity. This refers to the query raised by council members a number of times about
whether genomics could tell them if someone was truly San or not. After all, if, as the genomist has said countless times, there was something special about the San DNA that made it valuable to researchers around the world, then surely you researchers can tell us who has this special DNA and who doesn't. It's kind of the thought process. The researchers' response that, in fact, no such diagnosis of identity was possible was initially hard to grasp, since medical genomics was presented as effectively predicting illness. So why couldn't the same techniques be used to diagnose identity? On the surface, we can see the San desire for genomics to serve as an objective arbiter of identity and redress as a kind of science for the people. And yet it's not qualitatively different if we think about it from the UK border control or the Kuwaiti database, which seeks to diagnose true from fake members of a group. The power and problematic of the field, to reiterate, is this dexterity, useful at both ends of the lines of power, border agents and indigenous councils, where in both cases the desire for science to arbitrate citizenship and identity tends to displace other forms of group making with potentially dire consequences. In the second example, we're going to travel to Durban, South Africa, where in 2001, the World Conference on Racism was convened, and at which a heated dispute ensued between representatives of the Indian government and the Dalit movement over whether caste discrimination should be included on the international agenda as a form of oppression akin to racism. Dalits, as you'll recall, refers to the untouchable caste status within the Hindu hierarchy. The Indian government, it comes as no surprise, resisted their appeal in Durban and was largely successful in eliminating any mention of caste in the conference proceedings and outcomes document. Then, in 2009, when the Durban Review Committee convened in Geneva to evaluate progress towards the conference goals, a sizable delegation of Dalit representatives traveled to Geneva to, quote, raise their voices against the wall of silence they were met with at the Durban Review Conference. Since then, and here's where the emperor's new genes come on the scene, some Dalit activists have actually welcomed genomics research. Specifically, they draw on findings that support the theory of Aryan migration into India, seeing in it, quote, proof of the idea that upper castes are alien to the subcontinent, and where a charge of biological outsiderness is an attempt to undermine the legitimate right of upper castes to monopolize power and resources. At the same time, some among the Hindu right have latched onto studies that suggest that the European contribution to the South Asian gene pool is minimal. This, they contend, supports an Aryan indigenousness hypothesis, in which their status as outsiders is no longer called into question. So population genomics in this context has become an unlikely ally on both sides of a very heated and at times deadly struggle over the legitimate parameters of citizenship. The dexterity of the field, supporting as it does two competing accounts of Indian peoplehood, serves as a window onto a broader context in which genomic data is enrolled as an arbiter of group boundaries and belonging. And I would argue that whether it's from above or from below, the political economic context in which the subaltern genome, we might call it, codes, still requires sustained and critical attention. In other words, no matter who's actually using or asserting it, our critical faculties should still kick in. For example, the field is advancing at a time when the pharmaceutical industry faces a major crisis, where an estimated $140 billion worth of drugs will lose their patents between 2012 and 2017. And companies are under pressure to reconfigure their business models and find new markets as blockbuster drugs fall over the so-called patent cliff. The one-size-fits-all model of drug development is giving way to a niche marketing strategy in which companies are turning to growth potential in specialty markets and in emerging nations. As Jonathan Cahn's book, Race in a Bottle, so brilliantly illustrates, one way of resuscitating intellectual property claims and establishing a niche is by employing racial ethnic categories. That is, racialized understandings of biological difference becomes the value added for expanding patent life. In response to this voracious global biocapitalism, we might say, a number of countries are attempting to control the terms of this expansion rather than simply allow foreign researchers and companies to approach their populations as resources for genetic samples and as markets for new drugs. The policy framework for exercising this control is genomic sovereignty. As one US-based investor lamented, the expansion of big pharma into foreign markets has, quote, hit a roadblock, nationalism. Likewise, one prominent Mexican official explained the need for Mexico's genomic sovereignty amendment, which was codified in 2008 in these terms. We believe that if we don't carry out studies to understand our genomic patrimony, no one will, because they'll be interested in their own populations. Secondly, should the interest exist and they come to get this information, they make us dependent on it, and then it'll cost us. We have to develop our own genomic information. In this context, new biopolitical entities are being imagined: Mexican DNA, Kuwaiti DNA, Indian DNA, and even the anti-apartheid genome, among others, as part of a kind of political imaginary that's strategically calibrating existing social differences, such as race, ethnicity, with genetic groupings. So on one level, genomic sovereignty we could see as representing a deeply nationalist sentiment of self-determination in a time of increasing globalization. It implicitly brands a national population as biologically distinct, naturalizing nation-state boundaries to ensure that countries receive any economic and medical benefits that may result from the field. But despite the seeming empowerment idiom, what sociologist Catherine Bliss aptly calls an anti-racist racialism, the long-term implications are worrisome. And I would argue that such policies are better examined for the kinds of intranational power relations that they at once hide rather than combat, a point that I'd be happy to expand upon. Because it links this work on genomics with forms of racialization occurring via algorithms and in other fields where racial logics and assumptions are built into the design of the database. Something I'd be happy to talk about if anyone's interested. So for now, what I want to convey is that there's more to national genome initiatives than producing tailored drugs and precision medicine. On this point, anthropologist Karen Sutausig's insights are instructive when she says, while the vision, promise, and hope around genomics are clearly forms of future building, one has to wonder if these phenomena themselves, rather than the therapies they point to, make up the commodity being bought and sold in the contemporary marketplace. Again, drawing our attention back to vision, imagination, hope, how it's produced, what work it's doing, how might we intervene analytically and politically in its fabrication. In a recent volume on what they term socio-technical imaginaries, Jasanoff and Kim describe collective imaginations of the future that encode not only visions of what's attainable through science and technology, but also of how life ought or ought not to be lived. In this respect, they express a society's shared understandings of good and evil, they say. So in this final strand of the talk, I want to flag very briefly 5 ways in which I see imagination around science and technology often constricted. The acronym A-Life refers to the ahistorical, legalistic, individualistic, fixed, and euphemistic fallacies, which I hope can get us thinking about how we can now stretch our pedagogy, policies, and political praxis around science and technology. So the first constriction is an ahistorical fallacy, when we tend to project forward in time without the temporal corollary, a careful examination of historical precedents and processes. Too often the contours of our thinking mirror the hyperbolic rhetoric of science, breakthrough, cutting edge, miraculous, leading us to overlook continuities as we celebrate all that appears novel. As just one example with respect to personalized medicine, socially subordinate groups who are too often targeted by police and border agents may have an altogether different sense of what it means for those in authority, including healthcare providers, to solicit detailed information about them. Initiatives such as the UK Provenance pilot project and the Kuwaiti DNA testing program don't simply harm those individuals who are the target, but the effects become part of the collective memory and experience of a group, fostering justifiable suspicion towards those in authority. But without attention to histories of state-sanctioned harm, it's impossible for those carrying out something like Obama's precision medicine initiative to understand how one person's tailored healthcare may be another person's unwanted surveillance. The second way we may inadvertently constrict our ethical imagination is a legalistic fallacy, when we assume that reforming policies and laws is sufficient to shaping the context of science and medicine for the greater good. The passage of the U.S. Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, for example, is an important but not adequate step to ensure that employers and insurance companies won't exercise bias against those found to have a genetic predisposition towards some illness. As the Data and Society Research Institute argues, legal frames are not always the best way to grapple with ethical concerns. Indeed, much of what's at stake isn't necessarily running afoul of the law per se, even if it's still making people uncomfortable, like when data uncovers information we'd rather keep hidden or making inaccurate assumptions about us. Beyond a narrow regulatory vision, how might experts from a variety of sources, including academia, civil society groups, industry, and others, develop ethical and legal frameworks for handling data's predictive capabilities and its ability to move across various sectors and platforms? So the passage of new laws can't stand in for this larger undertaking. The third way we may inadvertently limit the scope of our concerns is an informed fallacy, when we presume that standard approaches to informed consent are sufficient in arenas that are characterized by the proliferation and movement of data. Consent often gets boiled down to obtuse contracts, and as different companies take ownership of data, terms of service and terms of use may become obsolete. Data is portable, so the same regulations don't apply to all actors. While an individual may agree to give his or her information to one application, they might be upset to learn that this data has then been sold or has changed hands without giving proper notice. So even when individuals consent to provide seemingly innocuous information like a zip code or birth date, all data has the capacity to become personally identifying through a combination and re-identification. So signing on the dotted line, however elaborate the fine print, can't stand in for a more thoroughgoing engagement with the complexity of information that's being produced, as well as all of the things that we cannot and perhaps should not know in the process. The fourth is a fixed fallacy, which is the tendency to assume that the way in which scientific harms get enacted in the present will look the same way that they did in the past, rather than mutating with the times. In the context of e-health and predictive algorithms that deem people to be at risk for some condition as a way to presumably help them, labels can further stigmatize already marginalized people. And the problem with algorithmic discrimination is that it may be harder to detect. According to the Data and Society Research Institute again, discrimination can occur when individuals volunteer their personal information, but this data is then applied, say, to family members or others who didn't choose to release it. Individual choices can affect entire groups of people, and the big data phenomenon makes it difficult to draw barriers between the personal and the collective. So that a bioethics apparatus that's predicated on individual rights has limited value in an increasingly networked society. By drawing our attention to such shifts, the fixed fallacy serves as a counterweight in some ways to the ahistorical fallacy, by alerting us to the mercurial and often liberal context by which individual choices can reinforce oppressive hierarchies. Last but not least, the fifth way we may inadvertently constrict our ethical imagination is through the euphemistic fallacy, which is when we adopt language to describe healthcare transformations that are already seeded with a particular perspective that ignores or downplays the concerns of those who are potentially harmed. When we present the notion of precision medicine as a straightforward good, we can obscure how larger government policies based on precision and privatization exacerbate suffering and illness. So that in focusing in on individual risk factors, especially at the genomic level, the social determinants of health and the forms of accountability to which that should give rise tends to take a back seat. Another euphemistic buzzword that I think we should think critically about is this idea of scientific and technical literacy. Too often, I think, specialists in a given field express concern about a lack of knowledge among various publics. And yet, we rarely hear talk of social literacy, whereby scientists and technologists are challenged to draw upon insights from the humanities and social sciences to increase their own understanding so as not to rely on flat conceptions colored by stereotypes and deficits. Our language, in other words, how we frame problems and potential solutions, serve as roadmaps that keep us either riding in circles or finding a way out of the current crises we collectively face. So that in moving forward, there are many ways I think we can begin expanding our collective imagination to actively prioritize justice and equity in the design of science and technology. First and foremost, I think we have to collectively refuse the notion that questions of social justice are anti-science or Luddite, when in fact I would argue that these preoccupations are the foundation of good science, technology, and medicine. So that what I'm describing here is an expansive set of concerns, one that avoids the many fallacious constrictions I've just described, requires that we radically reimagine how notions of health, well-being, and the good life can fuel the development and design of technoscience. Granted, that may not sound very realistic, but I think the struggle to envision liberatory science and democratized data is precisely one of the battles that we have to wage in order to enact it. Thank you for your attention.
That's an incredibly rich presentation, and much of what I'm going to say here is really sort of elaborations, thoughts, questions, more so than direct comments, and I hope to keep it short so that we can actually engage the audience. So beginning with Ruha's fundamental question, where is the human in the data? What I think she's trying to direct us to is not just the blatantly, or the problem of blatantly racist data, the phrenology, the skull measurements, the old bad science, or even the highly criticized and clumsy efforts of the Kuwaiti government to restrict citizenship. But it's rather the new, the 2.0, which she describes as, quote, the banal and seemingly more benign forms of data production where the social and political dimensions of the production process may be hidden from view. And as I understand it, in this inquiry, what is central is not the search for specific identities, that is, whether or not a particular population was counted or considered, but rather the ways in which hegemony, and in particular racial hegemony, is reproduced through a relational structure in which the freedom of some is tied to the containment of others, the way in which, as she puts it, innovation and inequity are bound up together. My way of sort of thinking about it is the way in which the material and the conceptual framework constitute a kind of racial math equation, which is constantly sort of maintaining and updating a racial status quo. So the racial status quo is not static, but it is subject to the technological innovations that are brought to it, which make the math equation always have to come out in balance in a certain kind of way. So in this sense, the technologies of science do not only stand apart from this apparatus, in other words, they're not outside of this racial apparatus, they're a central part of its construction. And in fact, the prized intellectual property, which reinscribes race and racial hierarchy by conceptualizing the human as an already racially marked category. And the normative structure, which I think she's pointing us towards, is the way in which the normative structure shapes the scientific inquiry in ways which determine what are the important human characteristics that should be measured, what are the outcomes that we care about, and what are the legitimate modes of interrogation. And all of these, I would argue, are sutured to the historical and contemporary processes of racial capitalism in which value and property are racially encoded. So what we value is what we study, and what we study is what we value. Catherine McKittrick's recent address here as part of the Black Feminism Conference on the Algorithm and the Song, Part 1, described the use of a computer algorithm that attempted to predict which among a group of young black people were quote unquote ultra high risk of being shot and ostensibly utilized an intervention program to prevent it. The program, which was underfunded, failed to prevent the death of a young black man who had been identified as high risk. But importantly, as McKittrick described it, premature death was a methodological variable, an outcome that was wired into the program. And it's in this sense, if we think of the human in the data as the search for human life or the betterment of, or in some sense, achieving some degree of improvement on human life, the living human being, we can see that actually black life is outside the parameters of this inquiry, even ironically when presumably the objective is to intervene on its behalf. That is, the racial accounting at the heart of these equations rests not on black life, but at best on its precarity. As Ruha illustrates in a range of examples from the Beauty Queen selection to the Minority Report pre-crime programs, at the heart of predictive policing, the irony is that the growing reliance on the algorithm as the neutral arbiter of empirical facts, the innovation, is embraced as a way of avoiding the subjective biases of individuals. But what is in fact happening at the material level is both the reflection and the amplification of underlying patterns of subordination and, I would argue, underlying conceptions of what is human, right? The big data processes and algorithmic magic that both disappear and reconstruct race as an objective fact, as an external construct to the project, are a new technology, but in some important ways rest upon not only racially inflected facts, but racially inflected logics that have a longer, dare I use the word, pedigree. So to go back to the opening example of Kuwait and its DNA database, one sees the use, as Ruha points out, of biotechnology to arbitrate citizenship. It's exclusionary in its intentions and objectives, while deploying a kind of dragnet, overly inclusive, sweeping inclusiveness in order to achieve its aims. But even as the means, that is this sweeping inclusiveness, may be subject to critique, to some extent what is being normalized and what is sort of accepted as legitimate under here is the idea of grounding citizenship claims on proof of ancestry. So thus, we are quick to see the problem of the birther movement's racist challenge to Obama's presidency, the birther challenges, and point out that he has demonstrated through documentary evidence, as distinct from biotechnology, his place of birth and therefore his citizenship, and we accept that as sort of definitive. But this notion of birthright citizenship itself, which is enshrined in the 14th Amendment's mandate that all persons born or naturalized in the US are citizens of the United States, represents both an opening and an enclosure. And by that I mean that the 14th Amendment repudiated Dred Scott's refusal to recognize the possibility of black citizenship and Dred Scott's construction of all black people, enslaved or free, as stateless property of a nation. But it also enacted a kind of enforced belonging in that the terms and conditions of that membership, whether black people would receive anything other than formal emancipation for what had been visited upon them, were left undetermined. And the revolutionary struggle of black people in the wake of the Civil War to answer that question during the period of Reconstruction, which achieved remarkable gains, was ultimately put down, though never totally extinguished, through the violence of white reaction. And this issue then of enforced belonging is probably more visible in the context of Native American people's challenge to US sovereignty, which constantly reminds us about how settler colonialism operates as a system through both forced inclusion and exclusion. And my point is that, with regard to the citizenship question, is not to diminish the important achievement of birthright citizenship in this historical context, but to note the ways in which our notions of citizenship, regardless of what technologies we are deploying, remain grounded in biological metaphors of blood and ancestry. And these are racially encoded concepts rather than modalities that we might consider, such as participation, membership, commitments, and practice. So these genetic metaphors underwrite the biotechnology that Ruha draws our attention to, and that Ruha reminds us are really embedded with racial logics that are baked into the programs, the product of racist assumptions that mask themselves under the rubric of colorblind objectivity. So the problem that we face is that the emperor's new genes, as it turns out, are closely related to the old genes, the old logics of empire and settler colonialism. So the move from the old essentialist notion of race and biology to race as a social construct now morphs into race as genetics that conflates genetic gene sequence with a national identity. We can laugh at that, but there is a certain way in which the underlying moves are actually not that far apart. The implications of the question then of where is the human in the data take us beyond the critique of determinism and even beyond the inclusion of the formally excluded, because it takes us to, as she points out, the question of commodification and inclusion. And ultimately, I think, under a system of racial capitalism, how does biotechnology become a property which is subject to patterns of segregation, appropriation, exile, and the like that constitute a racial geography that is all too familiar to us. And I'm going to leave it there because I want to leave some time for conversation.
So I was really interested in the framing of epigenetic metaphors as lingua democratica. And I'm very interested in the productive potential of epigenetics, but I've also sort of been following over the past years that I think epigenetic frames can also be used in very reductive ways to sort of obscure things about social relations. I also was just sort of thinking about that relative to this goal of subaltern genomes being able to code and trying to imagine how that might be materialized. So I thought I would ask you, you know, sort of in the most not potentially idealistic, but certainly optimistic imagination you could exercise, what might that look like? Like what would be a sort of anti-subordination approach to deploying genetic arguments, aside from the elements of that you've already touched on?
Yeah. So there's two questions there. One is around sort of troubling the straightforward alternative of epigenetics as I presented. The second is around thinking about what a subaltern science, I would say. I framed it as a kind of subaltern genomics, but I want to think broadly in terms of what counts as knowledge and science and the possibilities for that. For the first question, I also, in terms of seeing how epigenetics as presented as a clearly non-deterministic option, alternative to genetics. I've also been following, for example, the work of Martine Lapp and Sarah Richardson, who on the one hand show how the epi in epigenetics is often operationalized in very narrow terms, that what we think of as the environment that counts, that's interaction with genetics, is still often quite biological and not in terms of thinking about what are the various environmental factors, but also it doesn't radically shift the political implications. That is, when you think about the environment that's often the focus of the womb, the mother's health, various behaviors, the onus still very much is individualized. It puts the guilt, let's say, on various health disparities, on people who are already struggling within a political economic context in which their range of choices are still quite constricted. And so the implications of thinking about epigenetics as an alternative or as a more radically kind of liberatory science, I think is being challenged by a lot of the sociologists and anthropologists who are studying how it's being operationalized, and I am sympathetic to that critique. In terms of a subaltern science, so, you know, on the one hand, the way that through the ethnographic work, I see various alternatives arising in the situation of the San and the South African genomic case. One of the things that's interesting is to see how various actors, various participants understand the stakes of getting involved. One of the things, the frameworks that's often described in these contexts is one of benefit sharing and one of power sharing in these contexts. So it's not simply that we want the fruits of the science, but we want to be able to shape the agendas and the questions and the frameworks far upstream. So power sharing as a corollary to benefit sharing. And it's interesting in that case where, you know, initially what was on the table was thinking, okay, how can we, you know, how can we invest in better healthcare? How can this come back around to affect people's lives, quality of life? And one of the things that the council members were really emphasizing was, one of the things we really have a stake in is having our young people getting trained in this science so they can affect the agendas and the framework. So the capacity building aspect of it was really central to them. The idea that they wanted youth from their community to be able to go to the university and get trained in the science. And it's interesting now, anthropologist Kim Tallbear, her newer project, as I understand it, is also studying the work of indigenous genomicists to think about how they're sort of conceiving their work, its relationship to community. And again, it's thinking about whether, we don't have many examples to sort of study long term, whether that actually changes the science. Does the science actually change the kinds of questions, the quality, the various things? And so I think, in my study of the South African genomics and Tallbear's study of Native American genomicists in this country, I think that's still an open question to see how liberatory it actually will be, how much the range of actors that are involved actually changes the epistemology, changes the outcome. So in some ways it's an open question. But one of the things I would like to see is to stretch what we think of as valuable knowledge production and what we enter into that box of science, right? So that it isn't limited to whatever the newest, most cutting edge thing is, where we're always chasing where the dollars are. That's what I see with a lot of the genomic sovereignty legislation, with a lot of the interest, is that the agenda has been set, the money is being funneled into this direction, and so to participate, you have to in many ways align whatever your interests are in terms of health and well-being with where the resources are headed. So if you think about the entire public health infrastructures, in Mexico, where we visited when I was here at the Institute, created an entirely new constitutional amendment devoted to genomic sovereignty, genomic science, an entire new health ministry devoted to it. So you begin to see that the infrastructure, the agendas, the imagination of entire polities become aligned with where the grants and the resources and the investment go. So I would like to see, if I had to sort of think as radically as I could, that not being the case, that you actually get to say, what science and health initiatives would we most like to see investment in and knowledge around, irregardless of the agendas being set in Europe and the US? What would it mean for, however many billions of dollars that we're now putting into this, sort of invested in what we think is most crucial for the citizens of our country, despite the excitement and hype and miracles that we're told are going to come from this field. So it's a matter of actually having power to do that, right, as opposed to just participating in a vision that others have created. So that's some of my thinking around that. Yeah, no, but you're absolutely right that the framing of both the kind of, those kind of computer algorithms that are built into now our entire sort of justice system and all kinds of other things, employment, education, in terms of weeding out bad teachers. There's entire algorithms that spit out scores for teachers of whether they're good or bad, and just fire teachers based on their scores as opposed to the qualitative. And the exact logic is that it removes the human bias and subjectivity from it. And what we see is obviously that doesn't happen. But so part of the question is, okay, should our focus be on making it more rigorous and more sort of objective, or something else? And my thinking around that is that the solution, I don't see a technological fix to bias being the answer. Not only because it's not technically feasible, that there has to be humans deciding how to code the algorithm. So even if it was technically feasible, I do not think that a technological fix to what we understand as a disparity or a problem in a particular social arena is where our energies need to reside. So, for example, if we think about these algorithms in the criminal justice system. So one idea is, okay, we make it more rigorous so we really know who's going to be the offenders. or we think much more fundamentally about incarceration as a solution for various kinds of social problems, you know? So one idea that's floated is, okay, what if the risk scores, instead of predicting, being about the risk of someone committing a violent crime, what if it actually tracked, so that's where we invested resources in terms of community building and employment. So you're at high risk for this, not so that we can catch you doing a future crime, but so that we can actually, build up the communities and the employment and education for particular populations that are deemed more likely to struggle, with various things. And so to me, that is not a technological fix. It's about questioning our social values and how we want to use these technologies, what we want to do with them. And so ultimately, I don't think we shouldn't be trying to make these things or question the bias built into them. That's partly the project. But I think in terms of investing social policy, in terms of our sort of thinking about, where to invest activism, it shouldn't be on honing the technology. It should be about questioning the values that then frame what technologies we want to invest in, what we want them to do. Do we want to get it so that the risk scores really corroborate who's going to be, more likely? Or do we want to think, okay, should we abolish prisons and incarceration and take a step back more radically and question, the larger social system in which these technologies are trying to, more precisely identify the problem people, right? I hope that answers.
I could just say really ditto, and I probably should, but I would say that I think it underscores the question of what are the characteristics that we think are important, and what is the objective that we're trying to achieve. And so that might then, instead of looking at this as a question of the output, like we're tracking the data to look at the output, that we're rather looking at it from the question of what have been the inputs, what has been the things that have contributed to this particular set of circumstances that the person now finds themselves in, and how can we, from an almost epidemiological perspective, trace that back to a set of social structures and decisions that lead there. Because really it has to do with understanding that, I sort of reiterate this earlier, what we measure is what we care about, and what we care about is what we measure. So it would, I think, really not suggest a kind of refusal of what data, either qualitative or so-called objective, and I say so-called objective only because of the problems that we've encountered regarding what objectivity sometimes tends to occlude. Or the claim of objectivity sometimes tends to include, but maybe what we might think of as more classically empirical facts, qualitative facts, whether they're achieved qualitatively or through some other data collection means, why we are collecting them and what is it that we are caring about. I mean, one might describe the sort of pre-crime model as, well, we care about recidivism, but that's really, again, a focus on the output. It's on the question of behavior control, really. And I think that it really requires a more shifting back to putting the human into the data, which would say we actually care about this person. We care about this person's life and what it is that has produced the crisis at this point, why it is that they are where they are, right? It's a different inquiry.
Comments really, questions coming. Two things, the Kuwaiti thing you mentioned in the San, and how far back are they going to go in history as to what maps they're using, as to where people are from, because all that's political constructs. Has nothing to do with people wherever you live. So that's a question. That's one thing. The other was, came to mind is we're putting all this money in education into STEM. Everything's a science, technology, math, magic, digital, thank you. And those are all wonderful skills to have, but what about at the service of sociology, anthropology, cultural things where we're studying people, as opposed to that being the focus. And so then maybe the question is how do you get institutions like
Yeah.
UCLA. and,
Yeah.
But even starting at elementary school,
Yeah.
high school, to focus on, to put money into, yeah, that's great, you have this technological information, and make that a baseline for everybody.
Yeah.
But let's, incentivize you for going into
Yeah.
sociology, for anthropology,
Yeah.
things that are going to support.
Yeah, I mean, that's another example of the, so there's a lot of energy and excitement and investment in this set of fields. So part of the shift then becomes, people want to say, well, students of color are just as good in them, and this is what we should have them in our schools, and we want to align that. But again, you are participating and being included in an agenda that you haven't fully framed. So then the humanistic aspects of STEM are not necessarily prioritized, right? And so that's why I see, for example, the broadening through STEAM and including the arts, and I would say the humanities, the social sciences. I think that is a more, going back to the question, Professor Panofsky's question, about sort of what does justice look like. It looks like being able to actually frame the underlying agenda that then you are then including yourself and participating in. Just saying included in a STEM agenda that you have had no input in building is not enough, and getting resources to do that and so on. And so, for example, I point to, there are a number of scholars who are thinking about how do we actually shape the underlying agenda. On the first point about ancestry, it's interesting. We're living in just an interesting time where some things that we might have thought of as pretty settled facts about our common ancestry still get opened up as, it's not quite settled. We had a group of students in Texas this week who walked out of their class because their teacher mentioned that we all came from Africa. And they were so angry with that formulation, and also its link to this particular political moment, that they walked out and were refuting that as, some kind of biased, brainwashing. And so I do think that, that this idea of ancestry and how far we go back, it's just an interesting, but still contested notion that, we want to still decide at what point we start policing and deciding where the various lines broke. So it's just a random factoid that I've just found so startling that, we're still debating that. Okay.
I just had a comment in relation to kind of how epigenetics work. And Sheena Lomawaima has been doing some work with this, in particular, along with Ken Talbert, right? Yeah. And kind of the critique. Like, epigenetics still is in that framed model, right? That can't measure native survival, right? The algorithm can't measure, and this is back to McPitch right there, I had the pleasure of seeing that. Can't measure native lives. She was particularly talking about black lives, but I also think this goes for native lives. They can only, on non-colonial terms, right? They can only measure in those colonial terms. So in the epigenetic kind of conversation, Sheena Lomawaima talks about, they only talk about damage going one way, but not if those genes are affecting Native people that way, what is it doing to these supposed white genes, right? How is it propagating? There's like a kind of understated way that's supporting white supremacy. And then I was thinking about Rosie Simmons, who's a choreographer and a dancer who'll be at Riverside next week. But she talks about this particularly in We Wait in Darkness, or she dances the body back from the Kenzoa damming of Seneca land, which is our land. And she talks about why does DNA only go one way, right? Kind of doing this kind of metaphorvis. So in all this epigenetic sort of work, we see there only being a unidirectional sort of way, colonial measurements coming in, racialized colonial measurements coming into play. And I was wondering if you could talk about that kind of framing of that unidirectional sort of notion of epigenetics. I don't understand genetics. I like rely on her to
let me think about that a little bit. It's so interesting, and I haven't engaged that work, but this idea of the unidirectional is a new way for me to think about the power relations and who gets to sort of direct the implications of this knowledge. And that kind of goes back again to the question of justice. Is there a way to subvert that direction and have it work and do things that we weren't expecting it to do, and make kind of knowledge claims around it? Let me think about that a little bit. Yeah, it's really interesting.
I want to
to Mishana, I love that, and I was thinking in your talk, which I loved, and I love the response.
Yeah.
You know, I love you both. I was thinking about kind of the somebody like Sharon Tadega, who's doing work around neuroscience and psychology, and these new studies where white people are put in MRIs and asked questions about race, and there are no synapses are firing in an empathetic way around racism and white supremacy, and some of the argument about that encoded in the DNA of white people is an inability to have racial empathy, and therefore, what are the circumstances? Like, what's the possibility of ever using kind of these moral appeals for social justice and these frameworks if it's genetically impossible for white supremacy to be kind of dismantled in that way? So I find this work to be incredibly provocative. And, you know, it also, so I was thinking about that, and then also thinking about, just to hear your response, you know, in my field in information studies and information science, you know, we wholly accept that data is a social construction. We don't, it's not even a question.
That's your starting point.
That's at the beginning, and yet to hear about it so often talked about in these scientific spaces as if it is fixed, static, known, a truth. You know, I just wonder when you say kind of those of us who work in kind of race and these ideas of race as a social construction being, you know, those ideas being kind of supplanted by these ideas of genetics being fixed or an objective truth. How might we create new imaginaries of disrupting science and framing science, as many people have done for centuries, as a political project rather than an objective-seeking project, right? So just thinking about some of these things, your talk is so provocative and fantastic. And,
Thank you.
Makes me think about where the interventions should be.
Yeah, on that last point, I was thinking about Britt Russert's work. She'll have a book coming out soon called Fugitive Science, which traces this genealogy of anti-racist science, both in fiction and in actual, you know, practice, mostly in the U.S. and I think, you know, tracing all the way through slavery, that as much as attention we've poured into understanding the history of eugenics and racial science, there's been this parallel genealogy of especially Black and Indigenous people creating a fugitive science that does exactly many of these things. So partly it's to study that history to understand how to build upon it, because in many ways when we too tightly link science with eugenics or science with racism, and we don't recoup this alternative genealogy, we don't know how to answer Professor Panofsky's question about how do we build a just science, because we haven't learned the history of people doing that, right? And so that's partly why I'm excited about her work, and others too who trace this alternative genealogy. As to the neuroscience of racism, what that is. I was just on a panel on Monday with a psychiatrist. I don't know how she calls herself, disciplinary, but she has a lab and they put people in brain scans and to study stereotyping and looking for the parts of the brain that lights up and so on. So she was explaining this, and her point, sort of the take-home point for her, was of how deeply embedded it is. So that was the take-home, right? And I'm thinking about Oliver Rollins and Torsten Heinemann, and are also studying and have a work coming out around these labs that are studying not the neuroscience of race, but of racism. And it's so interesting to me, but partly what I understand from their work and where I'm more sympathetic is that we still have to question that framing of, you know, it being so embedded. So for example, they say, okay, so what's the take home from this? So in terms of, say, a real social arena, we would put all the guys and all the people that are in police academy, put them through brain scans, and we would only let those people who show neuroscientifically that they're not prejudiced continue onto the police force. Like, the implications of saying that racism is that deeply embedded and not something that is sort of, you know, produced in social relations and through institutions and codified, to say it's that, then that means that the solution or the intervention becomes at the level of biology and sorting out the bad apples from the good apples. And that runs completely counter to critical race, our understanding of what racism is. And so, because the solution would then be only the good cops, the ones who've proven in their brain scan that they're not going to stereotype, right? But then we know that that is not how it works, right? And so I think the take home for me is that even the science, the biology of racism, the science that seems to be being used for good, we have to question its framing and how it could be deployed and its implications for policy. It's not to say we got to shut it all down, but we can't simply support science that aligns with our goals politically. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting. I want to look up this person's work, but I think that's where it's headed now. Like, in some ways, the critique of racist science has been domesticated. Many students now who are getting their PhDs, getting life sciences, they are sort of taking on this common sense that you described in data science. Like, we know that we don't want to do these bad things that have been done in the past, so we're going to use these tools for good. So we're going to find out how racism is in the brain or how violence is in the gene, and then we'll use it for good in the world. And I think we have to also really question the underlying methods and assumptions that guides that work as much as we do the stuff that's straightforwardly problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about the alignment between this neuroscientific project and particular forms of Black resistance that articulated, you know what I'm talking about. So we could even go back to Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. The sort of narrative of white creation is coming out of a notion of genetic deviance, right? And what that counter-narrative was about really resisting white supremacy, but we also recognize, I think we do, the underlying fallacy of it as a scientific claim. But what I was more so thinking about is that one of the areas that I think, again, we might pick up Ruha's call to sort of try to have a different kind of imaginary is, rather than looking in the brain as some kind of finite container in which we're looking for parts that are either lighting up or not lighting up in response to particular stimuli, is to understand something that comes out of other different knowledge communities, which has to do with the deep relationship between mind and body, which is to say, the ways in which we perceive things actually have physical effects on the body. Why would we think that's not the same for the brain? That is to say, rather than thinking about it as one-way causation, it's actually systemic. And so what we're actually looking at is a relational situation, not a one-way thing. But I think that, you know, I mean, I'm just putting that out there as a set of questions because I've seen some of the literature, the whole thing about, you know, what lights up the amygdala, you know, the fear response. I believe that those responses are being measured. The question is, what are they telling us? And I think that we have to, you know, sort of start to think about a different conceptual frame for interpreting that information.
Yeah, that's right on. Question back then.
Hi, thank you guys so much. This has been incredible. So I'm actually a neuroscience graduate student. I'm interested in neuroendocrinology. And so while it's like a little bit of a different vein, I definitely am cognizant of the implications that looking at sex steroid hormones in relation to the ongoing dialogue on gender and sexual fluidity and all that has. Like, my research has such implications on society. And so when you're talking about the imaginative and about the need for the power to shake up the kind of social construct of science that we are in, I was wondering if you had any ideas for these individuals, such as myself, such as people coming up and who have to fit in to the current system in order to then gain prominence and then shake it up at a later date. Like, how do we take that personal responsibility and just make sure that we are contributing to the problem that we're trying to solve?
Yeah, that's really.
I'm gonna leave that to you.
Yeah, I mean, that really is the $6 million question. My answer is not going to be very specific. I just will tell you how I think. So partly it's a it's a question of how to kind of infiltrate unjust systems, how to gain the skills, how to gain mastery and participate, but also begin to subvert it from the inside out, as opposed to just critique it from the outside, right? And I mean, step one for me is that you have to do it in community with others. I don't think it should be on the shoulders of individual students who are really the least powerful in this kind of feudal system that we operate in academia. Should not be on your shoulders to do it, where also the possibility of you then paying consequences for trying to step out. So in community with other students, and I've seen this start to happen in medical school settings, I'm sure it's a different context than what PhD in life sciences, neuroscience, and so on. But what I've seen is it's never a majority, but a critical mass of students actually saying to those in positions of power, their administrators, the university, I'm here, I'm paying tuition, there's a responsibility you have to give me the training that will let me be the best professional I can be. And they frame it as, you are currently sort of training me to do something, and you're not giving me the full set of skills that I need to actually perform this work in the world that we live in. And so, for example, the White Coats for Black Lives movement is one iteration of students in different campuses coming together and building, linking their concerns, their disciplinary professional concerns, with the broader social movement that is happening in today. And so I think partly in community, and also linking what is the broader context in which you care about, carrying out your work as a professional, right, in service to something bigger than your own reputation and your own prestige, right? And so I think that there's models, for example, that to think about how you would begin to, or maybe it already exists that you need to plug into it, maybe not. But I've seen how that, framing it in that way, I've seen it start to, for example, a group of students that I was working with at Yale Medical School actually having their curriculums be changed starting this semester that includes, it broadens the curriculum to include this not as a token module on race and health disparities, but actually framing the entire first year, curriculum around racial justice and health, right? And so through raising their voices, working together, knocking on doors, pulling in speakers, activism on campus, changing the curriculum that then will be the curriculum for all future medical students coming through there, right? And so in some ways stretching the imagination of what it means to be a good doctor, what it means to be a good scientist. So at the genetics of the origins of what it means, right? And so I think I've seen it sort of take place in other neighboring fields that you might look to, for example.
Well, on that hopeful note, I'm going to ask one last quick question, because this series is meant to be reaching a subsequent audience of practitioners in healthcare and in social services.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, for instance, how you might distill one or two key talking points. Let's say, if someone is later viewing this conversation as continuing education and then is trying to talk to a colleague about how to engage critically with race-based medicine. What are some of the sort of key takeaways you want to emphasize in terms of, again, translating this critique to practice?
So I think I would distill it down to two things. One is the take-home is not to employ a colorblind approach to health, to medicine, to technology. It's not to stop thinking or talking about race, but it's really to think about the historical and social production of race and how it takes shape in your field, whether that field be health or law or social work. So the answer is not to pretend it doesn't exist, but to be wary of how it's being operationalized. Too often it's being seen as something inherent or biological or fixed, and to question that, kind of formulation of race. And the other is to really stay alert to the technological fixes for social problems. In all of our arenas in which we work right now, the phenomenon of big data is allowing for more and more seemingly objective, algorithmic, data-driven solutions to social problems that would seem on the surface and will be framed to you as being a better alternative than relying on racist individuals or bias this or bias that. And that idea of bringing in a technological fix for what is fundamentally a social problem, we have many already in the short lifespan of big data, an understanding that that's not how it works. Not only do we build in our biases into the algorithms and to the solutions, but then the idea that then we never fully question or address the values and the problems to begin with. We don't tackle them at their much more fundamental level. So be wary of the next shiny, newest technological fix for whatever arena that you work in, and find ways in community collectively to actually say, perhaps that's not where we need to invest all of our energies, is to then take this new thing on, but to question, what is social work supposed to do? What is sort of, the work in my clinic supposed to do? And it's not simply going to be, the problem's going to be addressed by some new tech fix into that arena. Yeah.
Fabulous way to end. Please join me in thanking